the core of our purpose is to promote standards for charity accountability among charities, and to promote charities and trust for charities that meet those standards. But starting around 4 years ago, we started to try to analyze not only what makes a charity trustworthy, but what people in the general public might think make a charity trustworthy, because we think that's a component that's just as important. And so we do that in a couple of ways. We have the questions that go into trust and giving, but we also explore some special topics. Some of the topics we've explored before are disaster relief, sexual harassment in the charitable sector. We've also done an issue on COVID-19, and now we recently released one on impact. So why charity impact? As you know, this audience probably knows that the idea of charity impact and how to measure it has been around us for a very long time, initially driven by larger institutions, maybe government programs or foundations, that really wanted to look into how to justify their spending and how to compare alternatives. And it still is a very valuable, I think, tool for some of those larger donors and larger institutions. So this is not in any way to discredit that view, but we think that that idea has trickled into the concept that maybe the general public views that issue of charity impact in the same way. And something was telling us it might not be quite that way. So we wanted to know more about what it is that the public thinks about charity impact, how they understand the topic, how they view it. I will say that this presentation is not to define charity impact or to find the best definition, but really to understand how people view it. And so we enter the topic with four kind of ambitious objectives. One is what we'll really look into today, which is what does the public think about it? What does it mean to them? And given that about 80% of contributions still come from individuals from the general public, we think that that's a really important thing to kind of pin down. But then the other objectives that we won't really dig into today were, well, do they care? Does it matter in their giving decision? And then to look into how donors feel about competing priorities that are associated with charity impact, and how it fits into kind of their larger impulse to try to be impactful themselves or to try to make a difference. So the way we go about it is every December, and sometimes in the middle of the year, we'll commission this electronic survey of 2,100 people in the U.S. and 1,000 in Canada, but we won't talk about our Canadian friends today. So I guess the question for the day is, what does the public think about impact? What does it mean? And we started with a really broad question. So saying just that, when a charity talks to you about impact, do you know what they mean? And what we found is about half of people say they do, and the other half say they don't, or they're not sure. Now, this was true across generations, but there were some differences when we looked at different giving levels. So for lower giving levels, the portion of people who said they knew was lower than for people in upper giving levels. But even among people who say they donate $5,000 or more, only about 1 in 4 will still say that they don't know what charity impact means to them. And that to us is really very significant. At this point, it might also be helpful to actually try to define it. And I thought about putting people on the spot and telling them, what does it mean? Because I think even within the sector, we have trouble kind of defining it. But I will say the most satisfying explanation I've heard is that the output is kind of the results of your program. So for example, I planted 1,000 trees. The outcomes would be the change that came from that. So because I planted 1,000 trees, we have better air quality, the biodiversity in the area grew, the awareness from people who volunteered grew. So all of those would be outcomes. And then the impact is the result of the program if you were to isolate everything else that might have happened. And so the impact is much harder to pin down, and it's also much harder to compare across programs, across context, across organizations. But when it comes to the public, we think that the main way that the public would interact with the idea of charity impact is actually in charity appeals themselves, because that's where they hear different ways of saying, well, we are impactful for this reason, or this is how our impact looks. And so in that respect, we see four different kind of uses, common everyday uses of charity impact. One is reaching a goal. So we are impactful because we reached our goal of adopting all the animals that came to our shelter. The second alternative, and I'll put those on screen later, so don't worry about that. But the second alternative is due to efficiency. So we are impactful because we do more with your dollar. With $1, we might feed X amount of children. The third kind of reference that we see in charity appeals, it has to do with the quality of the programs. So we are impactful because our programs have more depth. We don't only feed the child, we educate the child, give him a mentor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the fourth application that we see is achievement numbers. So going back to results. So we are impactful because we accomplished 100 trees, or whatever it might be. So what we did is we put those alternatives in front of our survey takers, and we asked them to identify what they thought best described charity impact. And what we found is that people are split. So when in the broad sample, 26% felt that the best explanation had to do with achieving a goal, 22% had to do with efficiency, 18% with the quality of the program, and 14% just general achievement numbers. When we looked at different generational levels, we found that people are still split across every generation, but some different alternatives kind of come out with different generations. And so with Gen Zers, they were more focused on achieving a goal. With millennials, I think it's not as clear, but they were most focused on efficiency. And if you go the matures, you'll see that they're more focused on the depth of the program. And we also looked at different giving levels, and you'll see again across every giving levels, responses were split, but among giving levels between 1 and 1,000, the most popular answer had to do with achieving a goal, and efficiency was most popular among people who gave $5,000 or more. Then we had a different question that, and I actually put the question in the bottom, sorry, that the format here is a little different, but we asked people, imagine you receive a charity solicitation stating that for every dollar donated, the charity will be able to accomplish blank. How trustworthy do you think that information is? And what we found in general, this looks like a bell curve. So most people will tell you it's not super trustworthy, not super untrustworthy, somewhere in the middle. But there's also people at the extremes. So we really wanted to warn people, well, you might, by targeting some people that might be at one end of that curve who really respond positively to this kind of statement, you may actually be damaging your impression with other people at the other end of the curve who find this to be untrustworthy. So among matures, 27% of people rated the trustworthiness of a statement like this between 0 and 20. And also among people who did not donate, there was also that reaction that this wasn't a very trustworthy response. So we won't go into all the other stuff because we want to hear from the experts we have with us today. But what I will say is we have 4 general takeaways. One is that individuals are confused, or if not confused, they don't have a very clear definition of what they think charity impact means. And I've heard someone say that's actually an opportunity because that means that the charity has more control over their messaging. But we think what our recommendation would be is that clarity in communication is important so that the donor knows what you're talking about. And then kind of the second, I think, recommendation that follows from that is to remember to, or if you can, to do segmentation among your donors so that you talk to some generations different than others in different spaces and all of that. But if not, if you're really handling kind of one appeal for all your donors, that remember that different people respond to different messages. So maybe try to include multiple messaging within the same appeal so that the different people can respond to different things in your appeal. And then I guess, I don't know what time it is. Let me see if I'll quickly say the other 3, even though we didn't look at the statistics. The other thing we want people to keep in mind is to keep the idea of charity impact in perspective. What we found through our survey is that people care about charity impact, but they share kind of in the same scale as they would as other aspects, like overall trust for sure rated a little higher, financial ratios and other aspects like that. People care just about as much, and so they're really looking at a broader picture. They're responding emotionally and looking at a broader picture. So keep it in perspective. Don't overdo it when it comes to charity impact. Then the next one is to be careful about how we measure it ourselves, right? Because we don't want to create unintended pressures here. We like to remind people that even though donors like and can reward immediate results, they also really care about long-term results. In fact, they care a little bit more about long-term results. And the same is true with quality versus quantity or depth of programs. So make sure that when you're, measuring for yourself, that you're not creating pressures for short-term and quantity at the expense of things like long-term and depth and quality of your program. And then finally, it's a reminder that really people are trying to make a difference and to be impacting themselves, and charities are not the only way they have to do that. So keep in mind that there are other alternatives like giving to individuals directly, which is becoming more and more popular. And you really should speak to the individual's motivation and kind of build on that rather than necessarily your own. So that's what I have. I'll stop sharing my screen. And I really look forward to hearing from the other experts.
So that's terrific, Elvia. Thank you for teeing that up. The survey, I think, gave us some really solid information that we can use to better understand how donors think about impact. And we also have with us three individuals who are going to give us their sense as well. And I don't know if we have to have too much in the way of presentations, but we certainly want to get their sense. And so why don't we start with you, Jillian? Give us what your takeaways are from what you've heard.
Thank you. I don't want to go first. I'm afraid to set the tone. I just want to manage expectations. Elvia said that we should, or Julie said that we should speak for 10 minutes. I'm not sure if I have a tight 10, but I'll start the conversation with just a few of the key things that struck me in this conversation. But first, to introduce myself, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jillian Mershon. I lead the Saks Fifth Avenue Foundation and charitable initiatives at Saks. Prior to moving into the corporate sector, I worked in nonprofits for about 12 years across a lot of different issues. So I worked for public television, in financial literacy, in food insecurity and poverty. So issue agnostic, but all in mostly marketing communications lens. So a lot of what you'll hear from me comes with this perspective of like, how do we tell this story? How do we translate this into something that we would want to tell a potential donor? I also have to give a shout out to Creating Healthier Communities is a nonprofit on which I'm honored to sit on their board and who actually helped to connect me to this opportunity. So with that, and then having, worked in corporate philanthropy now for about 5 or 6 years, I like to think of myself as a student of impact, and there's always a way to keep learning. So the survey was incredible. It's the survey I didn't know I needed, right? And I think the first takeaway is that there's a misunderstanding about the term charity impact is not a surprise at all. I think when we hear the word impact, we all as practitioners at our core instinctually just kind of know what that means. But if Elvia had put me on the spot, I would have really had a hard time trying to define it, to be honest. So, part of the issue is there's no standard about this, especially for the public. There's no Kelley Blue Book. There's no college ranking to say that this is what this is worth. This makes this one organization better than another. And this is the end all be all across issues and interventions and universal metrics. So what surprised me, though, is that the individual donor states that they're more driven by the long-term impact and those attacking those systemic goals, because it really made me wonder over, especially the volume and reach question, because it really made me wonder, is that how people are giving? I would believe that at the 5,000 level and above, when people are digging in and trying to understand the issue and evaluating organizations across each other, but so many individual donors, especially, in that 3-figure place where we all are probably giving the 99% of us, is their gut decisions, and their decisions that are made on messages that happen over the course of 15 seconds. And so I'd be really curious to see how feasible it is to get those more nuanced stories of the ongoing advocacy, the research programs, the coalition building, those elements that we know build the foundation of strong programs. And does that really stand up against, like, telling those longer term stories, does that really stand up against we feed 10 million people, which is, I think, what a lot of donors are driven by. So it kind of gave me that feeling of, there's like an old story about how people would fake report on their Nielsen ratings to say that they did watch certain TV programs when they were actually watching something else completely different. That, I think people want to believe that they make decisions based on this, but I would actually be curious how that connects in reality. And I think that's kind of like the area that I kept struggling with was, if we only have just a very short time to get our point across, to help to educate donors about the work that we're doing, to help to bring them along on our journey. How can we explain the intersectionality of all of those issues, and explain our 20-year bet when it's such a tough message to get across? So I would just close with saying, from a corporate and foundation perspective, we really have the space to dive deep. Obviously, we're giving at a larger level, so we're positioned to, evaluate nonprofits against each other. We're positioned to think about what's the best way for our money to be catalytic. And I would love to see, my advice for the community would be, how could we make the donor community feel that same empowerment? The stat in this report that keeps me up at night, and I don't have the actual, the specific numbers in front of me, was that people feel a high responsibility to make a difference, but they don't feel like they have a power to make a difference. And so that's the place where I feel like we should think about stepping in, and what can we do together to make that message.
Great. So I think everything you said is very much in line with, I think, the way we kind of saw this study. When we went into it, a lot of us who think about this issue a lot were like, people aren't going to really know what they're talking about when they say impact. And I've said many times that the difficulty in measuring impact is that there are as many ways of measuring it as there are stars in the sky. And so, it's not surprising that people have different points of view about exactly what that is. And for some people, it seems like it's more of a feeling than it is an actual thing. But I'm really interested in hearing what Mark and Kevin have to say also. So Kevin, why don't we go to you?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. And at great risk of stifling the conversation, I will share a few slides to illustrate a few points here, if I may. I think I've got permissions to do that. Can you all see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
All right. So I guess the by way of background and the Reader's Digest version, my company is Donor Voice. We are a behavioral science fundraising agency. That means that when we fundraise on behalf of charities, and that's what we do for some of the largest brands in the US and globally, we're applying behavioral science to that work, which means we're applying the psychology of giving to our work. Our view is that you cannot optimize fundraising, and I don't care if you're raising money from people who are only able to write very small checks versus those who are writing 7-figure checks. You cannot maximize or optimize that outreach and that spend if you don't understand why people do what they do. And that's the business we're in. I was sort of struck by one of the conclusions on the slides that you all shared about perspective. So this first slide is an attempt to introduce just a touch of theory into the conversation and hopefully a bit of perspective as well. So impact, and this was already touched on, and I'm going to share a couple of actual examples of in-market testing with real human beings on what happens when you use some of these, you add some of these ingredients to your fundraising. So impact is, there's perceived impact and there's actual, and those are synonyms, I think, for the output versus outcomes references that were made earlier. And so one of the things you have to consider is how are we going to convey and talk about impact? And some of that is a pragmatic decision on the part of the charities. Not many of them have actual outcome data. And so you're left talking about perceived impact or outputs, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But the main point that I want to make is that, and this is the perspective piece that was referenced, impact is a bit of a contrived sort of industry term. No donors are running around talking about impact. What impact is doing, and it's only one of many levers that can deliver on this, there's a core psychological need that all people have. Again, I don't care if they're writing checks for 20 bucks or 7 figures. People want and need to feel competent in their decision making, and that includes their giving decisions. Competence is a core ingredient if we're going to foster kind of high quality motivation. High quality motivation is the gift that keeps on giving. I give once, and if I've got motivation to give, high quality motivation, I'll give again and again. Competence sits right alongside the two other key psychological needs of autonomy and relatedness. Rich people are frankly not that different from poor people. Rich people, we have found, have a slightly higher need for autonomy and agency, but otherwise are a lot more similar than different. I'm going to focus on competence here because that's often where sort of impact sits as a way, one of many ways to illustrate this idea of competence. And competence has sort of two strands that sit underneath it. There's what we are calling self-competence. That's the desire on my part, whether I'm given 20 bucks or $1 million, to feel like that money's not going to be wasted. That's my degree of self-competence. Now, you can also help convey competence and meet that psychological need that my decision to give you money was a good idea, and that's really what I'm trying to decide on, with some degree of organizational competence. And there's lots of different ways that can be presented to folks, but organizational competence would demonstrate that the program is worthwhile and that the organization has some degree of sort of efficacy in that program work. But importantly, and this was the point that was made earlier, impact is only one of the ways to deliver on competence. There's shared values, there's brand trust. Those are sort of visually represented on this slide as co-equals. They really aren't. We've done the modeling. I can tell you right now that shared values is the dominant driver for much of the giving decision. But I think it's also worth noting that these aren't really trade-offs. I don't have to decide in a given fundraising appeal or some communication that's going to be asking for money independent of channel. I don't have to decide on whether I'm going to invoke shared values, brand trust, or impact. All of those things can be done pretty neatly and discreetly within a single communication. So by way of example, we live in the world of direct marketing and live in-market testing. And we have tested damn near everything under the sun, including these illustrations here. So this is an email solicitation. That is the name of the game with this email that the folks on their donor list are receiving with the help now, the button at the bottom, and that goes to a donate page. This is the control for those who don't live in this sort of A/B testing direct marketing world is kind of the standard bearer that you're trying to beat. So this is the copy and the image. And then this is the test that was conceived of. And the test has a hypothesis behind it. The hypothesis here is that If we add to this appeal very specific language around what I would define as organizational competence and actual impact, that we can increase response. So this will increase the likelihood that folks are going to give. And so I've just highlighted the only thing that makes the test different from the control. And we have added in organizational competence. This isn't speaking to their dollars per se, but it is talking about what the organization has done. And this is very much actual impact, reducing childhood cases in these two countries by significant percentages. And lo and behold, the test won. We actually increased the percentage of people that gave, and we decreased the unsubscribes. So there are lots of instances where adding in impact information can make a material difference to people's behavior and choices. Here's another example just to round things out. Another control email, and again, name of the game here is getting people to click and donate. But this is a case where the test was what I would describe as more about self-competence, so speaking directly to their dollars that they're going to put in. The only difference is what's highlighted here, and this is very much perceived impact. This is about outputs. This is X dollars in gets you, Y meals out. And in this instance, you can see that also had a material impact on behavior in the response rate and the revenue raised. So same organization, same sort of general sort of subcategory and focus with international relief generally, and two different scenarios where we introduced we frame competence differently, and it's in one instance actual and then the other instance perceived kind of impact. So hopefully that was useful in speaking to that perspective piece and then giving some real in-market testing to get past the abstraction of it all.
Terrific. So we're going to go to Mark, and then maybe we can have a little bit of a chance for some Q&A.
Sorry, and thank you, Kevin and Julian, for your remarks. I guess the Wise Giving Alliance, Art and your team, Elvia, Julia, Bennett, everyone there, just congratulations on tackling this particular challenge around charity impact, because it is sort of difficult to really define. I think people get hung up, quite frankly. Elvia laid this out earlier. You go from inputs to outputs, the numbers of, to outcomes, and then you get impacts. And that bridge from outcomes to impacts sometimes gets a little fuzzy, right, for donors, right, to understand what we're talking about specifically as it relates to impact. So in the way of background for the participants on the call, my name is Mark Shamley. I am currently the Chief Operating Officer for the World Federation of Youth Clubs. And prior to that role, I was in the corporate social responsibility space, similar to Julian, where I ran a corporate foundation and also ran a trade association for 12 years that represented as a membership organization about 250 corporations and thousands of CSR executives who were, in those very advantageous roles of driving and directing their company's social responsibility agendas, and then at the same time looking to partner effectively with with communities and their partners and across the organization. And quite frankly, we often found ourselves in those conversations about what are we getting for the investment that we're making in these communities and these causes. And so in that space, what gets measured gets done. But now that I'm in this interesting organization, which I would best describe as an intermediary nonprofit organization representing about 74 independent youth organizations around the world. And that's in 40 different countries and territories, serving about 365,000 young people. And our history goes back to when we were a program under Boys and Girls Clubs of America. We are now an independent, separate 501c3, trying to do a similar sort of thing of providing safe spaces for young people with the oversight of a caring, trained adult who are training them and providing them with experiences to help provide hope and opportunity for these young people, right? So that's the gist of the organization in terms of what we do. And as a 2-year-old organization, our mission is to develop, enhance, advance youth organizations around the world, and again, provide a safe and nurturing place for young people. We grapple with this concept of impacts, like what kind of impacts can we have that quite frankly, there's a causal relationship between the work that we're doing and the impact that you're seeing, because you can see that there will be sort of changes, hopefully, with these young people, but ultimately, how much can we take credit for in terms of the work that we're doing? And those are the things that we're grappling with as an organization. I do believe that you have to blend both the data and the storytelling. I mean, it is critical that you marry the qualitative and the quantitative information to really compel individuals, whether they are corporations, foundations, the government, whomever, right? Whatever your funding streams, in order to compel those folks to give, that you have to be able to have a blended approach between qualitative and quantitative. From our perspective, we find our donors are interested in working with us because of the international footprint we bring and offer, right? That is really important for them to be able to say, hey, I could work with folks here in the US that have infrastructure and system in place that can provide some sense of comfort. I think, Kevin, you mentioned the idea of waste avoidance, right? I mean, so let's help people not avoid being wasteful in their contributions. And that's sort of one of the reasons why people tend to want to support the World Federation. And then oversight, right? So the infrastructure to be able to provide oversight with these organizations, some of them are very grassroots. Like I'm talking mom and pop organizations, passionate individuals, but not a lot of infrastructure, not a lot of, sort of knowledge and competencies around how to sort of develop and build a sustained organization. And that's kind of the oversight and transparency and the guidance that we provide in our organization. And then the third piece why people give to our organization would be convenience, right? It's just convenient because they don't have to do a lot of research in terms of international organizations. Can I trust them? Can I feel confident in making a donation to this particular charitable group outside of the United States? So it's those kinds of things that we bring to the table. And what we're going through right now is really testing that idea, because again, we're only about 2 years old. Right? We came out of Boys and Girls Clubs of America, but we're grappling with how do we talk about impact? How do we talk about the role of an intermediary organization that is really representing the sort of the sector as a whole to encourage people to support youth organizations internationally, with the understanding that you have this group that's out there helping to guide and sort of direct that giving in a very competent and comfortable way. Some of the things that sort of came out for me that jumped out of the survey, I was not surprised that half of the population really doesn't understand what charities are talking about when they talk about charity impact. I mean, that's just not a shock. One of the things that I thought was kind of interesting is this notion of, looking for immediate results versus long-term results, right? So, and how to balance between those two things. I tend to see from a funder, and I'm going to put my corporate funder hat back on, right? So as a corporate funder, sometimes we grapple with, like, are we funding for initiatives? Or are we funding for organizational success and sustained success? As funders, corporate funders, we tend to want to fund the initiatives that really align with sort of our investment and what it's important to us, but also at the same time, looking at ways to fund for sustained organizational success. This can be really challenging because that involves, okay, how do you quantify that? How do you really tell the story around investing in mission and all of those kinds of things? So this long-term, short-term thing is something that I think is really worth exploring a little bit more and maybe digging into how organizations can really tell that story, their story more effectively to get buy-in from their donors. So I'll pause there, and then we can open things up, Art, for conversation.
Terrific. Thanks, Mark.
Sure.
Well, I guess we're going to have some opportunity for Q&A. And while people think of their own questions, I'd like to just pose one to all of you, which is this. When you think about the reasons people give to a charitable organization, there are lots, right? We could think of religion. We could think of people are just humanitarian, or people feel good when they make a gift, or maybe they think they're actually going to achieve something with that gift. But I wonder to what extent they're giving based on what a charity has done in the past versus what it promises to do in the future. If you ask any company, probably, or a funder, they'll probably tell you, if you had a debt from the past, we're not going to pay for that, right? They want to talk about what you're going to do in the future. They don't want their money to go to anything from the past. They want it to go forward. So how important is it to talk about impact when in reality, what we're really trying to fund is what's going forward? And the truth is, because you did something in the past doesn't mean you're going to do it in the future. And impact doesn't measure the future, it only measures the past. I'm really curious, how people, do we really spend enough time thinking about that when we are trying to figure out how to assess impact? And Kevin, you may have some psychological studying on this. I'm just curious how much, when you look at appeals, charities are primarily focused on, here's what we're going to do. You're not focused on what we did. And the truth of that is, if you look at many health-related charities in particular, right? Health-related charities, we've been trying to solve these diseases for many years, hundreds of years in some cases. And we still have heart disease, still have cancer, still have all that. But people still support them. So are they supporting them because of what they did in the past, or are they supporting them because of the ideas and programs that they're promising to engage in the future? That's just a question to put out there.
I, as you were framing that question, something jumped in my mind in terms of small dollar donors versus large dollar donors, right? And I think if you pose that question to those particular segments of the population, I think you'll get a different response, right? I think you get, from those smaller dollar donors, you're going to get people who are buying into the reputation of the organization, the results of the organization, the stories about their connection and their personal values and how they align with that particular organization, right? And that is all based on historical performance, right? But then I think on the larger funder side, those larger gifts, they would be, I think, more open to the idea of funding for future, funding for a vision that a particular organization has laid out very concisely in terms of how they are attempting to tackle a segment or part of the problem that you have so skillfully laid out. Many of these things have not resolve themselves, right? And probably will never go away, but ultimately how they make a positive contribution to dealing with some of the negative effects of some of these causes and issues that exist in our society. And I think it's those larger funders who would be more apt to invest in sort of the vision. That's how we're positioning ourselves, right? Because we don't have that track record. We can't go back and say, here's 50 years of, empirical evidence and data and all these other kinds of things. We're selling hope, quite frankly. We're selling, the possibility of what we could potentially do.
So, Mark, I actually think the other side of that coin might be new and existing donors.
Right.
So, right, like you would think, my instinct tells me that existing donors are potentially focused in the past. This is the organization I've been supporting for 10 years. And, every year I give this amount and they feel good about that. But to win a new donor, you need to highlight the urgency of the issue at hand. So we can pass this bill, we can cure this disease, XYZ, and that might be the tipping point to bring in someone new.
Yeah, good point, Julian, for sure. Yep.
To me, Art, what this reminded me of a couple of I think surveys that we've heard of before, but one, or it's not surveys, but really behavioral research. One is that idea that a larger donor really wants to engage kind of the rational side in the giving, the rational side on the giving process, versus a smaller donor, which engaging that rational side might actually bring down that feeling of a good emotion that comes from giving. So from what I understand that research to mean, it means that a smaller donor is more likely to give an emotion and an instinct, and less likely to kind of have a revision of history. But I think at the same point, it goes to what Kevin was explaining earlier about that competence factor, where I think what might drive the giving is probably that idea of what the organization will do with your money in the future. But I feel that people still have that, if you can quickly trigger in them a sense that their money is safe, and kind of check the competence box, that probably is also helpful, if that makes sense. And I think that how you convey that is through your results, not through what you hope will happen in the future. So I bet it, my instinct is that people are giving for the future, but they need the reassurance of the past. And if you can get that across quickly and without really having people think about it, that's a good thing. But that's a challenge.
Yeah, I guess I would suggest, I'm not sure there's much of a temporal lens on the giving. And I think the distinction that's drawn between rich and poor is often portrayed as sort of Grand Canyon wide. And I think it's more sidewalk crack. The rich people are going to be very rational if you ask them and suggest that they want to look at the financials and they're going to make some deep informed decision. That's often just post-rationalization. The vast majority of giving, at least giving that matters, which means giving that's going to be ongoing. Most upfront investment of new donors is a loss leader. The retention rates in the sector are atrocious. So the only giving that matters is the giving from folks who elect to do it more than once and form a habit. Almost all of that giving is autobiographical and personal. Shared values is the dominant reason that I'm going to give to any cause. And that might sound obvious, but or to use the health charity example, health charities, we've done a lot of work with health charities, and they are the ultimate paradox in that those people who give money to the big charities of which you mentioned, but any disease charity, the ones who give and keep giving, meaning not some event-based gala or doing the 5K. I'm talking about the folks who routinely give year after year. They're also on the beneficiary side. They've got some direct connection to type 1 diabetes or cancer or MS. And the paradox is that they're giving in spite of the organization, not because of it. The fundraising that is cranked out for these folks is the antithesis of personal and recognizing kind of the shared values and the reason for the giving. So a lot of giving is in spite of the organization, not because of it. Almost all giving is personal and autobiographical, regardless of sector. And I'm not sure there's much of a temporal lens on that decision making.
Kevin, let me drill just a little bit deeper into the thought you had that it's sort of a paradox when you say that the way they're appealing to people doesn't necessarily match what they need to do. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, so let's take a type 1 diabetes disease charity. If I'm a parent of a newly diagnosed child with type 1, the reason that I'm going to a diabetes group, first and foremost, is for information resource. I'm trying to educate myself and do a better job, being more informed to care for my child. If that need is met, first of all, that need's understood and met, then I'm likely to reciprocate. Now, but the vast majority of fundraising that piece which is knowable goes unknown. And so there's just a lot of soliciting and fundraising that treats people like they're widgets on an assembly line, rather than recognizing what's really driving their giving behavior, trying to satisfy that need so that they can feel good about a giving decision to the organization. And the same thing plays out in international relief, where, again, if you don't understand that there are some people who are giving because they are globalist in nature, that's kind of an identity that they have, and they've got values and goals that go with that, and that those people are very different from first generation immigrants who may have immigrated from that exact same place that you're trying to fundraise for. Those are two populations that have different motivations, values, and needs, and they require very different sort of messaging and communication, but they all get squeezed into sort of this one size fits all world.
Wonderful. So Jillian, and maybe Mark too, I have a different kind of question for you, given that you're giving with a corporate lens. And we've heard a lot about how companies really focus on what they're trying to do from a business standpoint, even though, you know, the two can sometimes be very separate, right? The corporate foundation is sort of a separate entity in some ways than the corporation itself. But there is this sense that there needs to be some type of alignment between what the company is trying to do from a business standpoint and what the charitable philosophy is for the organization's foundation or their corporate giving programs. And I'm just curious to know, to what extent does impact actually play a role in that? These seem to be things that are more focused to match with the business than actually impact. And maybe organizations don't even need to have impact if they can deliver for you what you actually need in your business. So help me with that.
So, yes, we need impact. Let's start there. Two different examples. So, first, prior to working at Saks, I was on the CSR team at Comcast, which is like the country's largest internet provider. So Comcast's CSR platform is around bridging the digital divide, providing underserved communities with digital literacy, actual hardware, so like computers, free internet access, and then across a pipeline of developing digital skills and training for the new economy, for jobs for the future, all with the future goal of you could be a Comcast employee one day. Like, we're looking to educate they are looking to educate the next generation of employees. So that impact had a specific business goal. And so they're actually thinking of themselves as part of that ecosystem and how their investments in these communities can actually support their business, 5, 10, 20 years down the line. So I think that that's a very common, smart, strategic way for corporations to think about their CSR platform. And then I'll transition to Saks and say our foundation focuses on mental health. Not because Saks is a luxury retailer has anything to do with that space other than we care about it. We think it's important. We know our people care about it, and that's where we want to put our money. So it's interesting because we have, before I joined, there have been a lot of conversations about should Saks play a larger role in women's empowerment or issues that might make more sense for the brand technically. But when we thought about, our dollars and areas where we felt were underfunded, areas where we actually thought that we might be able to develop partnerships that weren't getting the spotlight that they could be given, that maybe Saks was the right organization to step in and take that place. So it's a completely different take that doesn't have anything to do with our industry, but proud of what we've been able to do.
That's wonderful.
So,
what's your sense of that?
Yeah, I'm going to give my sense as well. I love, Julian, what you just described, because I'm going to sort of share somewhat of a different perspective, right? Because what Julian described with Comcast is like absolute alignment, right? It's about digital divide. It's about the brand. It's about the products that they offer. When I worked at Tupperware running their program, our thing was around environmental sustainability. And so And, you know, with the advent of ESG, so environment, social, and governance, and materiality is playing a big role in how corporations are approaching this work differently, like with a mindset of connection to the business, connection to the issues that have some sort of relationship or connection to the success and the viability of the business. And for that brand, that Tupperware brand, environmental sustainability became a big issue around plastic use and about single plastic use and about, you know, durable alternatives and all of these kinds of things, and how to position that brand as an alternative, right? And so all of a sudden, our philanthropy and our social responsibility work needed to shift from sort of like this focus on youth to still more work around environmental sustainability and funding organizations that were aligned in that area. So, you know, it really is very much about taking a step back and saying, well, what's important to our business? And then how do we want to sort of to show up in these places is really critical. And like what Julian described is like, that's perfect around mental health. Like that's important to the brand. That's a place that's unfunded. That's an issue that is becoming more and more of a concern around all over the place around the world, right? And dealing with that crisis. So it made perfect sense for them. And then it also made perfect sense for Tupperware because that was mission critical for their brand as well. So it all really depends. The key is to have those conversations so that there is an authentic relationship between what the company is doing in the community and what the brand stands for, and the values as well.
All right, so here's another kind of question for you all, and I think we have about another couple of minutes, so you won't be able to go into it in too much depth. But, you know, we keep telling charities, at least I try to tell them, that you're not going to be successful in everything you try.
Right.
And if you are successful in everything you try, maybe you aren't trying hard enough to do bigger things, right? There should be things that you fail at, right? And so, you know, the big issue then is what happens when I do fail? And is there a sense that donors will say, we understand and we're going to continue to support you, or will charities be penalized? Jillian, you mentioned that it does matter, impact does matter, but how does that work? I mean, how do you balance this need for charities to be innovative and maybe fail and overreach what their capacities are sometimes and not hit that mark versus, you know, you said there was going to be 10 things happening this year and you only did 5. Sorry, we're not happy.
Yeah, I mean, look at the last 18 months, right? I set my grant making portfolio in February of 2020. So like none of that worked out. But what you can do as a funder, in addition to, you know, I think Mark mentioned the supporting sustainable gifts that, or maybe multi-year gifts, or support general operating funds. That's always within a foundation's power. But you know, to have an open dialogue about pivots that are necessary, and you know, we tried this didn't work, this is how we're going to change, and giving nonprofits that flexibility, I think is, you know, it's not just respectful, it's part of a partnership, which is, I think, part of something that is missing. There's a lot of conversation around the power dynamics in the funding community, but I think that it's a lot of times a part of the foundation and donor education about, you know, what does it mean to be a partner, and how do we come together in that respect?
Yeah. And Kevin, you talk about shared values. I think you said shared objectives, or as the number one driver in your mind of giving. I suspect you would also say that those people who share those objectives will give a charity a pass from time to time when they don't hit those goals.
Yeah, I guess mass market fundraising, those folks aren't exposed to charity failures. And I would argue charities are both certainly on the fundraising side. I can't speak to the program side as much. They are risk averse, and to their detriment. I expect that is a cultural thing that bleeds over to the program side. You know, a lot of these groups are dying a slow death. And in some ways, the thing that would be the best shock to the system is to accelerate the death. You get a lot of groups that are highly redundant. There's very little, and it takes a long time to go out of business, unlike in the private sector. And so a lot of these groups could use a real shock to the system.
Yeah. Well, we have about just 2 minutes, and I guess I should wrap this session up by thanking all three of you for joining us for this session, and all of our guests as well for listening in. We're going to obviously do more of these to stay on this particular theme. And to Elvia and the team that put together this really great and dynamic study, congratulations to you. And by the way, for those of you out there, if you want to get further insight on this, reach out to us. Elvia is available on a limited basis to do presentations to different groups on this. We want to get her out there because she's so terrific. So if you have a need to hear more about this study, she can give you a lot more details, even in different languages. We had her do it for people in Japan. We had a group of 50 some charitable leaders from Japan join us for a Zoom session, and Elvia was just terrific, even though they had to do it in 2 different languages. So
I was going to say I can do Spanish, but beyond that, I need a translator. So. Thank you, Art. And it's especially great to hear from others who have real life expertise on the issues and to go deeper. So thank you all for joining us.
great.
And Art, if there's anyone that's on the chat that or Q&A that has a question or something that we didn't get a chance to get to, I'm happy to respond offline or something like that. If that's, I know we're constrained by time. I want to be sensitive to that.
Yeah, and send us your questions, and there'll be a short survey that goes out after, as you know.
Okay.
Just to get your sense of how you thought we did this time and what we could have done to improve it, but probably get a better host. But you're right. We're kind of out of time, and I just want to thank everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next time.